Welcome to the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies Online. For more information about our programs, publications and membership, please visit our website, themuslimfaculty.org.
Well, we're looking at this important paper of Dr. Yasin, which is apparently about whether you pray with your hands by your sides, called Sadl, or with your hands crossed across your chest, called Qabd. But what we discovered when we get in, it's not really about those details, because in fact both positions are valid. It's really about the nature of what is Sunnah. What is Sunnah? That's what emerged from. Can you just make space for? What emerged from the discussion is that it wasn't really about the detail of whether you pray like that or like that. What was indicated by the different positions was in fact the nature of Sunnah. What is Sunnah? And we saw, as Dr. Yasin pointed out, that an attempt has been made, and we'll see another attempt, a similar attempt today. An attempt has been made by the Orientalists to say that Sunnah, of course, which is one of the two major sources of our deen, the Sunnah and the book, and the Sunnah, was in fact an invention of the 3rd century of the Hijrah, is what the Orientalists were claiming. And therefore the Hadith, and on the basis of that they claimed that the Hadith had been forged in order to justify the Sunnah, in order that there should be some basis for the Sunnah taken back to the Prophet Salalau Alaihi Wasselem. Now what Yasin is showing is that the nature of Sunnah is not like that at all. And we'll come to today. So today he starts off having looked at in detail at the sources for both of these positions. And what did we discover basically about that? We discovered that the later sources point to the need for Qabd. And there are earlier sources which show that the Sadl was a position taken by many Muslims before, and of course the Qabd position. Why was that adopted by so many so many of the Muslims? Why has it been adopted by so many Muslims? Because of the Hadith which talk about it, and the lack of Hadith which talk about the Sadl, the position of Sadl. So, and of course that in a way it appears in a certain way to justify the case of these people who say that Sunnah was a later invention as a legal source, and that the Hadith were devised in order to justify the Sunnah.
That's what the Orientalists.
That's what the Orientalists are saying, and unfortunately, some Muslims who get caught up in the same thing. But, so he's got a section here now, Yasin, having looked at that, called Sunnah or Hadith. So this gets right back to the nitty-gritty of the matter. He says, Allah benefit us by him and prolong his life in this work, which he does so well. For the average Muslim today, Sunnah is effectively what is recorded in the books of Hadith that are assumed to contain all the reported sayings, acts, and tacit approvals of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, otherwise known as his Sunnah. although of course many of the point about that statement is that many of the tacit approvals of the Prophet ﷺ, of course, were not recorded, simply because no one said anything about them, because he didn't say anything about things that were going on, Salalau Alaihi Wasselem, and so there was no reason to record them. He simply allowed them to happen, and no one said anything about them necessarily. More specifically, it is what is recorded in the two Sahih collections of Al-Bukhari and Muslim. Sahih meaning sound. Although extended to include also the other 4 of the 6 books, which we looked at, if you remember, last time, and others like them. We remember he went through a whole lot of different collections of hadith, looking at these hadiths about the qabd. And others, according to the awareness of the individual concerned. 2 things, however, should be noted about these compilations, these collections of hadith. Firstly, almost all of them date from the middle of the 3rd century Hijrah or later. So that is from 250 onwards. That is, the men who compiled them were working in or around the middle of the 3rd century or later. The important exceptions to this rule are the collections of Malik, who died in the year 179, Abdul Razzaq, who died in the year 211, so all of this before that 250 mark, and Ibn Abi Shayba, who died in the year 235 of the Hijri. So all those who died before the year 250, who all lived and worked in the second part of the 2nd or early part of the 3rd century. So these were all earlier than when the major collections of hadith were put together. Secondly, if we compare these two types of hadith material, the earlier and the later, we find one major difference. The earlier works contain considerable material from the successors as well as from the Prophet ﷺ and the companions radiyallahu anhum. Whereas the later works consist almost entirely of Prophet only, as he puts in inverted commas, material, with some allowance for the first 4 Khalifas on top of that. In other words, what one could describe as a massive editing process has taken place, which we can date to somewhere in the first half of the 3rd century. So what has been edited out?
Companions.
The companions and the successors. So the material from the generation that came after the companions. In other words, but all, of course, that was much earlier. Their statements were much earlier than those people who were collecting the hadith. Before that date, the choice of material is very wide. After that date, it is almost exclusively prophetic. Because then, of course, they were, according to the system of Imam Shafi, it was necessary to take the action right back, take evidence of the action in text right back to the Prophet ﷺ himself. Now we have and this is a very important section. We have a section, the date of the Muwatta. Because he mentioned that the Muwatta, of course, being the first of all of the collections. Imam Malik having died in the year 179 in the 2nd century. At this point, a short digression is necessary before continuing with our main theme. Calder, one of these Orientalists, Arabists, has recently expressed doubt as to the 2nd century nature of what is normally considered to be Malik's Muwatta, suggesting that it is a Cordoban production of the latter part of the 3rd century. So again, another attempt. Now, to distance the existence of the deen from the source in the Quran and in the Sunnah, and we'll distance it from the early period. Now, why these people do this is a mystery in a way. Why do they do it? I think it's partly. It's obviously inspired by shaitan for the first thing. I mean, it's a satanic inspiration, clearly. But it may be that they just want to make a reputation for themselves, so they want to come up with some position that nobody else has come up with before, and find some way of proving it academically. Because it's all based. What's it all based on? The academic process. Doubt. It's all based on doubt. It's all based on doubting everything. So this was his idea, is the Qadam and the latter. So that's in the year two. That would be the year 280, 290. He's saying that that's.
He's saying that the Mudawana is before the Muwatta.
Well, we get to that in a minute. Yeah, because they say that the Mudawana, which is where the teaching of the Muwatta is made. They say that comes before the book on which it's based. So that's what. My own view, this is the view of Dr. Dutton, my own view is that the Muwatta is not only a product of Malik in Medina before his death in the year 179 of the Hijrah, but was also substantially in place before the year 150. So bringing it back even nearer to the beginning, thus making it our earliest extant text of this nature. The evidence for this is fourfold. He's gone into it in some detail. Four kinds of evidence he's basing this, his own judgment about the early nature of the Muwatta. Firstly, there exists a papyrus fragment of the text, which Abbott, another of these people, dates by textual evidence. So he's someone who's taking the other position, this other Orientalist. Which Abbott dates by textual evidence, particularly the characteristics of the script, the absence of glosses, the unsystematic order of the hadiths, and, most significantly, in her opinion, as a woman, the consistent use of an in the isnads, together with the absence of any initial transmission formula such as qala, akhbarani, hadathani, etc. So because of those things, which were early, obviously things that are connected with the very early period, she connects that to Malik's own day in the second half of the 2nd century. So that's one evidence, is a kind of textual evidence of the language.
Textual simplicity, in fact.
Yeah, well, something to do with and to do with the way it's written. Secondly, that's the first piece of evidence. Secondly, this is, and her name is Nabia Abbott. She sounds like she must be a Muslim. Nabia Abbott. Studies in literary. It comes from a book called Studies in Arabic Literary Papyri, or whatever. How was it? Papyri. University of Chicago Press, 1957. Anyway. We can. I won't go into the footnotes. We'll be here for 3 weeks. So that's the first. Secondly, the second piece of evidence, we possess an early parchment fragment. So that was papyrus, first one. Secondly, we possess an early parchment fragment dated from the year 288 AH of Ali. That's later, of Ali ibn Ziyad's. Who died in the year 183, of his transmission of the Muwatta, transmitted by a certain Hassan ibn Ahmad from Jabala ibn Hamad, who died in the year 299, from Sahnun, who died in the year 240, from Ali ibn Ziyad, who was Sahnun's main teacher. So this is a very, very clear isnad from very, very reliable men. Very absolutely authentic. So that's from the year 288. Those 3 previous transmitters are recorded in this part, and they were all absolutely reliable. Who was from Ali ibn Zayd, who was Sahnun's main teacher. Ibn Ziyad, who was the one who transmitted it from Malik. Ali Ibn Ziyad, who is credited with being the first to introduce the Muwatta into Ifriqiya. Ifriqiya was what? Tunisia it was. Yeah. Ifriqiya was Tunisia. Africa, yeah. Returned to Tunis in the year 150 AH. So he left Malik in the year 150 and then transmitted the Muwatta. And this transmission of his, and he didn't return. So that's makes it quite clear. Which year his transmission therefore must predate. So he must have got the Muwatta before the year 150 in order to be able to transmit it. At the very least, we are told that he was teaching it to Sahnun before the latter's departure for Egypt at the beginning of the year 178 AH. What's significant about that? Before the date of Imam Malik's death. We should also bear in mind that this is the same Sahnun who was responsible for transmitting the Mudawwana from Ibn al-Qasim, himself another transmitter of the Muwatta from Malik. So Ibn al-Qasim, so both of these, Ali ibn Ziyad and Ibn al-Qasim, both took the Muwatta directly from Imam Malik, which poses problems for Calder's claim that the Mudawwana is the earlier of the two books, because he was Ibn al-Qasim was in fact they are both related by or from the same person, Ibn al-Qasim, who died in the year 191. So it makes it quite clear that the Muwatta, in fact, predated the. So these other people, they try and invent these things. It doesn't make sense at all. Thirdly, so that's the second piece of evidence, this parchment. Thirdly, a comparison of Ibn Ziyad and the other transmissions currently available, either wholly or partly in printed form, those of Yahya ibn Yahya al-Laythi, al-Shaybani, who was, of course, the companion of Abu Hanifa. And we'll come to his Muwatta in a minute. And Al-Qanabi shows that all four are remarkably similar in their basic content and thus clearly represent one text. So they were all in different places and they all transmitted the same text. It is true that Al-Shaybani's transmission shows certain marked differences from the other three, but these are in the nature of editorial changes necessitated by Al-Shaybani's purpose in using Malik's Hadith in his teaching of Kufan fiqh, or the fiqh of Abu Hanifa. Thus, firstly, the order, chapter divisions and titles used for Al-Shaybani's material are very different from those of the other versions that we know. Secondly, and more importantly, he consistently excludes Malik's own comments and references to Madin and Amal, as well as excluding other reports, especially from the successors. In fact, what that does, in fact, it strengthens the basis of the original text. If you think about it.
But the omissions.
The fact that he omitted and kept some of the text but omitted other bits, in fact, show that the original, the basic original text was, in fact, strengthens the evidence for that. Instead, he includes his own references to the views of Abu Hanifa and the Fuqaha of Kufa, often adding his own hadiths. Thus, for instance, the sections on tayammum and reciting when praying behind an imam, to take random examples, in the transmissions of Yahya and Al-Qanabi, who transmitted directly from Malik, are almost identical, whereas Al-Shaybani, although retaining the prophetic and companion hadiths, excludes all the comments by Malik, adds his own comments, and in the case of the second section mentioned above, which is praying behind the Imam, adds 13 more hadiths from various authorities, including the Prophet Salalau Alaihi Wasselem. So the text originally was clearly the same, and then altered by Shaybani because he was in a different place and using it for a different reason, but wanted to have the authenticity of the original text of the Muwatta. In his chapter on li'an, which is the mutual invocation of its kind of divorce, Al-Shaybani relates only one short prophetic hadith from Malik, to which he adds comment that this is in accord with the Kufan position, whereas Yahya's transmission contains, in addition to the same short hadith, another much longer one about the sabab al-nuzul, the occasion of the reason for the revelation of the li'an verses which come in Surah Al-Baqarah, which does not accord with the Kufan position, as well as a quotation from Malik of the verses in question, and numerous reports from him concerning details arising from the same. So you can see what Dr. Yasin is doing. He's absolutely authenticating the whole business. Al-Shaybani's editing is even more evident when we consider Ibn Ziyad's transmission, which, although perhaps some 30 years earlier than Yahya's, is nevertheless remarkably similar to it. So remember, he left in the year 150. Remember, Imam Malik died in the year 30 years later. So he left Imam Malik when the Muwatta was obviously there was some over the years. Probably Imam Malik added some things, but he's nevertheless remarkably similar to it, although not quite as much as Al-Qa'nab is. So this earlier version is exactly the same as the later one, with a few differences. The chapter in Ibn Ziyad's transmission on the game of the sea, on in other words, what you take from the sea, Sadl Bahar, and the Aqiqah sacrifice, for instance, to take random examples, are very similar to those in Yahya's transmission of nearly 30 years later. Although Ibn Ziyad includes some extra comments from Malik, Ash-Shaybani, on the other hand, excludes most of the later post-companion material, and again adds his own comments. The difference is obviously that whereas Yahya, Al-Qa'nabi and Ibn Ziyad agreed with Malik's madhab and method, Al-Shaybani did not, but chose rather to include in his version only that material which he considered useful for his own teaching purposes. So he altered the Muwatta to suit himself. That which accorded with what was taught in Iraq. So, and that Muwatta of Shaybani still exists. Yeah, there's an edition of it. What concerns us here is that despite whatever editing has taken place, it is still Malik's Muwatta rather than some other text which has been edited. That's the point. Indeed, this overall similarity between the different transmissions speaks highly for the authenticity of the text and its attribution to Malik. We might also mention here the evidence of the of Ash-Shafi'i, another transmitter of the Muwatta from Malik. So Imam Shafi'i himself also learnt the Muwatta in Malik's circle, at Malik's feet, and transmitted it. In his sustained argument against Malik and the Madinans, he quotes extensively from Malik's book, and his quotations reflect a text almost identical with that of Yahya ibn Yahya's transmission, which was, of course, a late one, because Imam Shafi'i stayed with Imam Malik until Imam Malik died. So he left him after his death. And he quotes him in his book, and the quotations are exactly the same as that in the other version of the Muwatta from Yahya ibn Yahya, both in the wording and the order of the reports quoted. So all that is very definite. What is it definite evidence of? why is Dr. Yasin making this point?
The early.
To show that it's early. It shows it wasn't invented in Cordoba in the end of the 200s, but was definitely there in the year 150 years earlier. We should also take into consideration that this is the fragments of 4, possibly 5, other transmissions of the Muwatta also survive, namely those of Ibn Bukayr, who died in the year 226, all before 250, Ibn al-Qasim, who died in the year 191 earlier, Abu Sa'id al-Hadathani, who died in the year 240, and Abu Musab al-Zuhri, who died in the year 242, and possibly Ibn Wahab, who died in the year 197. So Dr. Yasin has investigated the matter pretty thoroughly. Since in the latter part of his life Ibn Ziyad was in Tunis, Yahya in Cordoba, Al-Shaybani in various parts of Iraq, Syria and Khorasan, and Al-Qanabi in Basra, or perhaps Mecca, Ibn Bukayr, Ibn al-Qasim, Ibn Wahab and Al-Shafi, if we include these last two, were in Egypt. Abu Sa'id was in Iraq, and Abu Musab in Medina. The only common link from which their transmissions could reasonably have derived is precisely that which is claimed in the sources to be the case, i.e., what was their source for all of them? Malik in Medina. Imam Malik in Medina, because they all went in different directions, they all had exactly the same book. Fourthly, that's all that's part of the third kind of evidence. Fourthly, we have the secondary evidence of the biographical literature, which tells us of numerous individuals transmitting the Muwatta directly from Malik, and also of several commentaries being written on it before Calder's proposed date of about 270 for the book's emergence, when he says it came out in Cordoba. E.g., then he mentions these ones. Those are Al-Akhfash, who died before the year 250, Ibn Muzayn, who died in the year 259. This latter compiled from the commentaries of Isa ibn Dinar, from another one, Yahya ibn Yahya al-Laythi, who died in the year 234, Muhammad bin Isa, Asbar ibn Faraj, not to mention those of Ibn Nafi', who died in the year 186, Ibn Wahab, who died in the year 197, of which an early parchment fragment dated to the year 293 and transmitted by an unknown scribe from Yahya ibn Aun, from Aun ibn Yusuf, from Ibn Wahab, survives. So again, there's an isnad then which actually ties it back to its original source. And others. These transmissions and commentaries would not, of course, have been possible had the text not. You couldn't have had commentaries on a text that didn't exist. Yeah. Given then that the earliest of the 3 early works mentioned above is that of Malik, we shall concentrate on Malik's view on this question of Sadl versus Qabd. So then we come. The reason of all this is because taking it right back to the beginning, before anybody's all these other things, what was Imam Malik's view on this question of Sadl versus Qabd, as reflected in the seemingly contradictory reports transmitted from him in the Muwatta and the Mudawwana. So in the Muwatta, the only hadith about the matter seems to suggest that it should be Qabd. And in the Mudawwana, it seems to suggest that it should be Sadl. We shall then consider the implications of this for a clearer understanding of the development in Islamic legal theory that led to the appearance of the Prophet-only hadith collections, such as those of Bukhari and Muslim, and the effective dethroning of books such as the Muwatta. Because the Muwatta is not, even though it's the earliest, and the isnad from Imam Malik through Nafi', through Ibn Umar, to the Prophet ﷺ is considered to be the golden isnad. Even so, the Muwatta is not considered to be one of the 6 books. So it's been dethroned in that sense. Which Shafi had once considered to be the most accurate book on the face of the earth after the Quran. That's a quotation from Imam Shafi in their favour. So, And then you come to another section called Malik and the Muwatta. First, remember all that we've seen so far is this authentication of the early nature of the Muwatta, and that there's no doubt about it. Firstly, it should be noted that the Muwatta is not simply a book of Hadith, even if that word is defined broadly to include reports from companions and even successors as well as from the Prophet. So in the first, it's quite clear that in the early days, Hadith, as we saw, the Hadith books contained a lot of transmissions from the Prophet ﷺ, from the companions, and from the Tabi'een. And a lot of those some of the ones from the Tabi'een were clearly just their own opinions, and other ones were what's called marfu'. What does that mean? Marfu'. They were ascribed to the Prophet ﷺ, but without any chain. So it is rather a book of Amal. The Muwatta is rather a book of Amal, practice, but not, as we shall see, simply local practice. So Amal means what people did, practice what people did. Or, to be more precise, a book of Hadith put into the context of Amal. So a book of Hadith, which was then put into the context of the ongoing practice of the people. That is, the book is ostensibly a record of various types of Hadith, but the key phrases in it are not so much those in the actual Hadiths. This is a very important point. So the key phrases in it are not so much those in the actual Hadiths, which are recognized as, for the great majority, to be absolutely sound, which may be at variance with one another, but nevertheless the one Hadith sometimes contradicts another in some way, as those in which Malik sums up a point by saying, and here we have it, as-sunnah indana. As-sunnah indana. The sunnah here, or the sunnah with us. Or as-sunnah allati la ikhtilafa fiha indana. The sunnah about which there is no dispute here among us. Or al-amr indana, the practice here, the thing that is done here. Or al-amr alladhi la ikhtilafa fihi indana, the practice about which there is no dispute among us here. Or some such phrase. This is what you find in the Muwatta, which is in fact independent of the Hadith. In other words, there may be different conflicting reports on a subject, but what should be done in any one case is what is or was done in Medina. So that's so the Hadith do not necessarily at all reflect the actual practice, although frequently, of course, they will. Secondly, it is important to recognize Malik's high reputation for excellence and accuracy in Hadith transmission. We know what he did what did he do? It's recorded what he did. He would ask people, what do you want to ask about? Is it a matter of opinion, or is it about Hadith? And if it was about Hadith, what did he do? He left the place, did a ghusl, changed his clothes, came back, and then talked about it. That was the respect he had for the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ.
He narrated very few Hadith.
And he didn't narrate that many either. Some of the companions refused to narrate Hadith, even though they had been with the Prophet ﷺ for a long time, simply because they were afraid they might attribute to him Even the slightest thing he didn't say. So they were very frightened of doing it. Because the Prophet said, if you relate something from me which I didn't say, then take your place in the fire. Not protect us. In other words, there may be different conflicting reports on a subject, but what should be done in any one case is what is or was done in Medina. Secondly, it is important to recognize Malik's high reputation for excellence and accuracy in hadith transmission. Indeed, in the transmission of knowledge in general. So, he was a past master at the formal report and is praised as such by all the major scholars of hadith. So all the people who later collected the hadith that we've talked about, they all praise him for being for his accuracy of reporting. Indeed, the isnad, as we've seen before, Malik, Nafi' ibn Umar, for instance, is considered by al-Bukhari and others to be the golden chain of authority, silsilat al-dhahab. However, as is implicit in the first point, it is not the formal report that primarily concerns him, but rather the fiqh. So although he had this excellent reputation for being absolutely accurate in reporting what from the Prophet ﷺ, that in the muwatis, that's not what concerns him. What concerns him is the fiqh, or correct understanding, to use the word in its original sense, of such reports. So it's whether they should be acted on or not. Accuracy of transmission is only one requirement. What is more important is an accurate understanding of the material. And of course, one man who was excellent at doing that, but who wasn't in Medina, was Abu Hanifa. Yeah. Abu Hanifa had a wonderful understanding, a brilliant mind, intellect. Malik combined both these qualities of accuracy of transmission and this ability to understand what was meant and what should be acted on. He was described by Ahmad ibn Hanbal as an imam in hadith and fiqh. So Imam Ahmad made a distinction between these two things, hadith and fiqh. Hadith, and then the ability to understand the hadith. While the famous hadith scholar Ibn Mahdi expressed the idea very clearly when he said, "Al-Thawri is an imam in hadith, but not an imam in sunnah." Al-Awza'i, after all these people had actually in the early days madhabs are named they were the basis of madhabs. Al-Awza'i is an imam in sunnah, but not an imam in hadith. Malik, however, is an imam in both. So there's another affirmation of him and his quality as a scholar in every sense. Being an imam in both meant firstly that he knew the context in which to evaluate the normative value of hadiths. In other words, whether they should be acted on or not. Secondly, that he knew the opinions of his predecessors arising from, but not necessarily covered by, those hadiths. So the knowledge of those people who were immediately before him, who were successors, who were the successors. And of course the companions before that. And thirdly, that he knew how to derive his own secondary judgments from this primary material. That is, he had an understanding, fiqh of the deen, and its normative form, sunnah. Without this understanding, hadiths, however authentic, could easily be a source of misguidance and error rather than a source of knowledge and enlightenment. Now, I mean, I'll read that sentence again, because this is what people should really know now, the people. Without this understanding, in other words, the fiqh, knowing all these, this knowledge of what's behind all the hadith, however authentic, could easily be a source of misguidance and error, rather than a source of knowledge and enlightenment. And that's what's happened in our time. People look at a hadith, they think they understand something from it, they act by it, and it's completely different from what anybody has ever done before. Thus, Ibn Wahab is recorded as saying, anyone who knows a hadith but does not have an imam in fiqh is astray, dal. And Ibn Wahab. And if Allah had not saved us through Malik and Al-Layth, who of course disagreed with Malik on many occasions. So, and if Allah had not saved us through Malik and Al-Layth, we would have gone astray. So they were the people who kept the thing straight. And Ibn Uyayna, another of the great early ulama, is recorded as saying, hadiths are a source of misguidance, madilla, except for the fuqaha, except for those who properly understand them. If therefore Malik records a hadith and then gives a judgment seemingly to the contrary, we have to assume that there was a good reason for him doing so. So on the basis of all this knowledge we've now had about Imam Malik, if he made a judgment contrary to an apparent nas, or to a text, to a hadith, we have to assume that that he had a very good reason for not acting by it. What Dr. Yasin says, what could that reason be? What could that reason be? How could that come about? A very significant statement is recorded. A very significant statement is recorded about Malik on this point. Qadi Iyad records that both Ibn al-Qasim and Ibn Wahab said, who as you know, as we heard, they were people from whom the Muwatta was transmitted. I saw that with Malik, Amal was stronger than Hadith. They said, these two great men, I saw that with Malik, Amal, in other words, the practice, was stronger than Hadith. Now, what does this mean about Malik, the past master at relating Hadith, and the man whose commitment and accuracy in the transmission of Hadith are second to none? So he had this wonderful knowledge of Hadith, and yet he says, with him, Amal, the practice, is more. Let us consider two more reports about the subject. Qadi Iyad continues. Malik said, there were people among the men of knowledge of the successors, the tabi'un, who would narrate certain hadith and hear other hadith from others. They would say, we are not ignorant of this, but the amal that has come down to us is different. Right? So they heard the hadith. The hadith contradicted what their position. They say that we know very well about these hadith, but we are in fact going by the practice that we have inherited. Another quote from Qadi Iyad. Malik said, I once saw Muhammad ibn Bakr ibn Hazm, who was a Qadi, being reproached by his brother Abdullah, who was an honest man with an extensive knowledge of hadith, for giving a judgment on a case when there was a hadith giving a different judgment. So there were two brothers. Abdullah said about his brother Muhammad that he was wrong for giving a judgment against the text of a hadith which he knew. Abdullah said, hasn't such and such a hadith come down about this matter that they were talking about? Muhammad replied, it has. Abdullah said, then why don't you give your judgment according to the hadith? Muhammad replied, but what is the position of the people with regard to it? Again, this is another. So what is the position of the people with regard to it? What people he's talking about? the people of Medina who were there, what is the agreed amal in Medina, by which he meant the amal of Medina was stronger than the hadith in that instance. Again, why should this be so? What does this mean? It means quite simply that Malik saw amal, practice, as a better indicator of sunnah than hadith. Here we get it. The sunnah indana, the practice in us. So, what is this sunnah? It is that practice which has come down in the Medina from the time of the Prophet Salalau Alaihi Wasselem. So it's exactly a prophetic sunnah. It means quite simply that Malik saw amal, the practice, as a better indicator of sunnah than hadith, and Malik being the scholar of al-Madinah. As Rabi'a, who was one of the seven, in the generation previous to Malik, there was what called Sab'a fuqaha, the seven great fuqaha of the what generation? Of the successors, of the success of the Tabi'in. Anyway, Rabi'a, who was one of these great men of knowledge, one of Malik's main teachers, is recorded to have said, 1,000 from 1,000 is preferable to me than 1 from 1. It's quite clear what that is, isn't it? In other words, that practice which comes down to the whole community is better than 1 from 2. We're talking then about a single hadith that has been reported. One from 1 would tear the sunnah right out of your hands. That's quite clear. And that applies even if the hadith is sound. 1,000 from 1,000 means a large number of successors taking from a large number of companions, which was only possible in Medina. Of course, that is why, for all his brilliance, Imam Abu Hanifa was not able to transmit the Sunnah in the same way. Because, where was he? In Iraq. And how many companions were in Iraq? Not very many. So it was never possible. That transmission by a whole community to the next generation was not possible in Kufa or in Basra. So 1,000 from 1,000 means a large number of successors taking from a large number of companions, which was only possible in Medina, and implies a transmission that was primarily by practice, amal, rather than text, hadith. Of course, they just did what. In fact, that's the way people pick up the deen. They take from the people before them. But of course, in Medina, at that time, it was right from the authentic beginning, right from the authentic source. 1 from 1, on the other hand, was the situation in the rest of the Muslim world, where individual successors took their knowledge from individual companions, like in Iraq or like in Syria. In Syria there were more companions than there were in Iraq. And on a more overtly textual basis, textual here does not necessarily mean documented in written form so much as transmitted in a fixed linguistic form. So it doesn't necessarily mean written, but it means that clearly transmitted. Such as is the case, for instance, with the text of the Quran. Thus, this amal of the Medinans, this 1,000 from 1,000 knowledge of how the Sharia was put into practice, automatically had in their view a higher authority than most hadiths, since amal had the status of being mutawatir. What does mutawatir mean?
Mass transmission.
Yeah, it means mass transmission with the condition. What is the condition?
It has to be right.
It's by so many people that it would not be possible for them all to lie about it. In other words, it's a mass. It's quite right. It's mass transmission. since Amal had the status of being mutawatir, that is, transmitted by so many companions that there could be no reasonable doubt about its authenticity. Whereas most hadiths were not mutawatir, but akhbar al-ahad, reporting by one person. That is, reports from only individual authorities. Maybe we should stop there today, because we're going an hour nearly. So we'll continue that. We'll continue that. Well, do you want to go on? We've got another few. We haven't got very much more to do. I thought we had more to do. We have only got a couple more pages. It should, however, be emphasized that Amal and Hadith are by no means mutually exclusive. Rather, Amal may or may not be recorded by Hadith, and Hadith may or may not record Amal. So where they overlap, they are a strong confirmation of each other. But where there is a contradiction, Amal is preferred to Hadith by Malik and the Madinans, even when the sources of these Hadiths are completely trustworthy. I made that clear. It is for this reason that Sadl, praying with your hands by your sides, is preferred to Qabd by Malik and the Madinans, even though, as we've seen, there are numerous hadiths to the contrary in the major collections, and nothing in them that overtly contradicts this position. They seem quite clear in that way. This way of standing for the prayer with one's hands by one's sides, as also the standard way of doing the adhan in Medina, or the way of reciting the Fatiha in the prayer without beginning with the Bismillah, or the size of the measures known as Sa' and Mud, to name a few other examples, which is the reason why we only do
the Fatiha.
No, well, I mean, I was thinking about the song before that. It's the reason in the adhan why we only do two takbir. And the reason, there is a hadith which says that all should be repeated. And because it was done twice, the people who take that hadith think you have to repeat the takbir again, because you have to do the two things twice. So that's again quite a clear example of something that's taken from a text, and not on the basis of actually what people were doing. To name but a few other examples, were matters that were not initially recorded in the form of hadith. No one actually. There was no hadith exactly saying them, but were nevertheless generally known amongst the people and understood to have originated as Sunnah in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So all those things were Sunnah. And a Sunnah not invented in the 3rd century, but a Sunnah coming right from Medina at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Other practices, although recorded in authentic hadiths and even transmitted, for example in the Muwatta, were not acted upon precisely because they did not represent the Sunnah. So here we come right to the meaning of Sunnah, which is the actual practice of the deen as it was done by the people from the time of the Prophet ﷺ in Medina onward. In other words, they were either exceptional instances or earlier judgments that had later been changed, or otherwise minority opinions that held little weight, and which, even though they derived from the Prophet ﷺ, were nevertheless outweighed by other judgments also deriving from the Prophet ﷺ. That's why you have to such an extensive knowledge before you can make judgments based on hadith. This is why Ibn Uyayna could say that hadith was a sort of source of misguidance except for the fuqaha, and Malik that Amal was more reliable than hadith. Of course, that Amal, specifically the Amal of Medina. It is here that we can also see the significance of the Shia Khawarij agreement on Sadl, because they both pray with their hands by their sides, and they're totally opposite to one another. These groups split away from the main body of the Muslims at a very early date, and on questions of belief and political authority, rather than on details of fiqh. They were political differences and doctrinal differences. They was not on the basis of the practice of the people. Their agreement on Sadl is thus strong confirmation of the ancient, in other words, very, very early, the ancient, indeed prophetic origin of this Amal, since there would have been no reason for them to invent such a detail. Why should they? The obvious inference is that they were merely continuing an already established practice. The implications of this are far-reaching. Firstly, it means that like the modern revisionist school of Western scholarship represented by Schacht and his followers, who are trying to situate the deen at a later date, we must seriously question the view Sunnah equals prophetic Hadith. So they question it, but we also must question it on the basis that we've seen. That is taken by the average Muslim scholar today, and has been taken by most since somewhere in the middle of the 3rd century age. And who came then and derived the system that meant this happened? Imam Shafi'i. Imam Shafi'i, who said every action has to be tied to a text. However, unlike the revisionists, the above critique does not enable us to discard the vast majority of hadith as a belated attempt to give authority to what was originally local practice, and that we don't take the position of these shayateen. The hadith literature, albeit in a predominantly oral form, existed. Malik's Muwatta is ample testimony to that. But it was subservient to Amal, and to practice. What we see happening in the burgeoning of the hadith collections of the 3rd century is a response to this redefinition of Sunnah within the ranks of the ulama, and the concomitant creation of a prophetic hadith imperative. So then, as I say, Imam Shafi said you have to have prophetic authority for everything you do. Therefore, there has to be a text saying this, that, or the other, for the practice. Once fiqh became based on prophetic hadith, rather than prophetic sunnah, they are not synonymous. Again, we have to make this absolutely clear. It was a natural and necessary step to seek to collect everything one could by way of a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, even if perhaps a little weak, and at the same time discard or disregard the material from later post-prophetic authorities. Hence the highly edited nature of all the major 3rd century collections of hadith. How are they edited? By, you heard earlier, by removing the later hadith which were not directly referred to the Prophet ﷺ. As for the amal or practice of Medina being local, it was indeed local in that it originated, flourished, and was first recorded in Medina, rather than anywhere else. But that was because the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ originated, flourished, and was first recorded in Medina rather than anywhere else. No other city in the Muslim world ever claimed the same authority for its own amal as did the Medinans, to the extent, that is, that any other city could be sent to have its own amal, its own practice. Rather, there was Medina, the center of the prophetic phenomenon, and there were individuals who went out from it. There was 1,000 from 1,000 in Medina, and there was 1 from 1 everywhere else. However, with the advent of the work of those such as Imam al-Shafi, who in the face of wide disagreement on details among the fuqaha of his time, wanted to impose some sort of logical standard on the entire corpus of fiqh, the traditional, non-textual argument of Amal was subjected to the logical standards of textual, particularly isnad, criticism. So the whole thing became based then on collected texts. Thus Sunnah, which had once been contained in Medina and Amal, Malik's As-Sunnah Indana, and As-Sunnah, so what is Sunnah with us, became redefined as prophetic hadith, and the anonymous, no isnad nature of the authority underlying Amal, because it didn't have the same logical strength, because even there weren't the people recording it in the same way. No isnad nature of the authority underlying Amal was rejected in the face of the demands of the new scholarship for an authentic isnad in which every man had to be known and trustworthy. So from the time of Imam Shafi'i onwards, that became the basis of the Sunnah.
They omitted it from the curriculum.
Yeah, they omitted the Amal. Who are these people? Shafi'i effectively asked, because of whose Amal these hadiths are not acted upon, thus putting his own position and that of those like him very clearly. Indeed, one would agree with Shaykh that it is a Shafi'i, with his insistence that only those rulings backed up by good textual credentials should be accepted as the basis of Sharia, who should be considered responsible for, or at least at the forefront of the widespread acceptance of the idea that Sunnah equals Hadith. So that's where it came about, as we said, with Imam Shafi'i. What we thus see illustrated by the major 3rd century collections of hadith in their almost total reliance on prophetic material to the exclusion of any other, and what we see reflected in the rejection of Sadl al-Qabd by later Sunni madhabs and several later Malikis, is the rejection of Sunnah as transmitted by Amal in favor of Sunnah as transmitted by Hadith. Now we have also, I would put a rider to that, in that if it had not been for Imam Shafi'i, rahimahullah ta'ala, doing this work and making sure of this, the deen was in danger of getting dispersed and lost and in so many different. It is quite clear that we owe to Imam Shafi'i the uniform transmission of the deen that's come down to our own time. May Allah reward him for that. But at the same time, in doing that, of course, a lot of this understanding of the Sunnah and Amal was lost. In both cases, this Sunnah was understood as being Sunnah of the Prophet Salalau Alaihi Wasselem. What differed was the methodology by which such knowledge was arrived at, and thus the details of its practical expression, namely the differences in the details of fiqh. The rejection of Amal in favor of Hadith, of practice in favor of text, was the triumph of the methodology of 1 from 1 over that from 1,000 from 1,000. And as the report from Rabia continues, 1 from 1 would tear the Sunnah right out of your hands. So that's that Sunnah, the Sunnah which was there in Medina, that living practice of the deen which had come down to Imam Malik, which he passed on through his Muwatta and through the Mudawana, became, as it were, lost. It was in the textual analysis of Imam Shafi'i. This suggests that if we want to arrive at a clearer picture of the original Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, we would do better to look at Medina and Amal rather than at the classical collections of Hadith. And that's where he ends his thing. And may Allah reward him for this work of taking the Sunnah right back to the very beginning.
What's the name of the work? What's the name of the work?
It's called Amal versus Hadith in Islamic Law, the case of Sadl al-Yadayn when doing the prayer. Yasin Dutton, Islamic Law and Society, Volume 3, Number 1, 1996. Alhamdulillah, finished then. Alhamdulillah. I'm sorry, it was quite a long class, but I'm glad to be able to finish it. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم ملك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد عبدك ورسولك النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.